It was late in the evening, well past sunset. I was in the library study, deep into my research on the finer theories of the Mage Hand spell, when I was pulled from the book by the sudden rapid clanging of the university's yard bell. In the few years that I have been attending at the University of Advanced Magics, never before had I heard the bell rung so violently. And then and there, it stood to reason the urgency must have been dire. Just as I had finished that thought, the double doors to the library were opened, and, there stood a very familiar figure. He was huffing and puffing, trying to catch his wind, of course, but it was Brummus. He was a year behind me in study, but we had become fast friends despite our class schedule being completely different. There was a lingering fear. It was growing just at the forefront of my mind, like I already knew what it was, but had not quite fully registered. I told myself that I would soon find out. "Brummus, over here!" I shouted. Brummus put one finger to his mouth, obviously demanding me to keep quiet. I set aside my book and dismissed the light spell. The library became suddenly dark. My eyes struggled to adjust. It then occurred to me, my more instinctual mind, that this was not the most secure place in the university, especially if there was any danger afoot. The library was not well traveled during the evening hours. After all, that is why I preferred the study in the evening. Help may be further away than I would have liked. "Is it a fire?" I whispered to Brummus as he approached me. He then clutched my right shoulder and forced me under the table. No, it couldn't have been a fire. Why else would we have been hiding? "No," Brummus whispered back. A long pause, and then he said, "I did it! I did it!" Brummus still trying to whisper, but obviously his uncontrolled jubilation was discernible under his breath. That small lingering sensation of fear that I was experiencing earlier suddenly became a very horrid realization. "No, you didn't!" I chided him. Brummus then shooed me. "I did, and I kinda didn't finish the last of the ruins of control." I gave a scowling, deadpan look of frustration towards Brummus, but a smaller part of me was also envious and excited for him. However, those feelings were soon ended when a loud thud, followed by crackling and splintering of wood, could be heard just right outside the library hall. More alert than ever, I focused my attention towards the library doors, still ajar, regrettably. I could hear distant shouts and conversations off in the distance of the campus, though too muffled to make out any exact words. It was no doubt they were talking of the recent incident, talking about how to evacuate and perhaps informing the great arch-magi of exactly what was going on. I suspect they put up a magical barrier around the library and labs, cutting off any exits. It was not good for me and Brummus. It then occurred to me the library had but one entrance, save for anyone breaking through one of the many high-walled windows. But with a potential barrier up, it would be useless now. I was formulating a plan when suddenly I felt Brummus's grip tighten around my wrist. His eyes were fixated on the library's entrance. And then, seeing it for the first time, its silhouette was unmistakable. But the eyes, they glowed red, like pinpoint tiny ruby jewels lit aflame with deep red fire. That is what I remember the most. I saw the red eyes dart back and forth rapidly. I didn't need to wonder whom or what it was searching for. It was Brummus and, now me. There it was, a white bleached skeleton stood under the library door's threshold, slightly hunched as if ready to pounce. It clutched in one bony maw a piece of wood, no doubtedly from the splintered chair, desk, or bench from the hallway we heard earlier. It was frightfully astonishing to see a complete skeleton standing erect, watching it move on its own with no muscles. Even more frightening was that it made no sound as it stepped into the room, save for the sound that its bony feet and toes made on the marbled floor. I would have thought the entire skeletal structure, or at least some joints, would have made sound as each piece rubbed against each other, especially if it were no longer muffled or silenced from flesh. But I was wrong. Very wrong. This thing is a danger in its own right. However, given the right conditions, it could be a nasty predator. It moved very carefully and with intent. I asked myself, did this thing, this creature, this monstrosity have sentience? I continued to watch. Not much else I could do. It was moving deeper into the library, silently twisting its head to and fro, searching with those red eyes. My mind raced, trying to come up with a solution, poring over lecture upon lecture about the undead. This school did not permit the practice officially, or any study of necromancy, so we had to rely on our cursory lectures and those of the good aligned faiths. Who was it? Clarence, I thought to myself. He was a devout believer. Oh, but what was his deity? I can't remember. If only he was around, he could, or he would know of some kind of spell or ritual or warding technique. Then the skeleton. It approached our location, but it had not yet noticed us hiding under the table. I signaled silently to Brummus to lift the table up and throw it at the thing. Brummus nodded in agreement. In one blurry flash of grunting and screaming, we picked the table up, a very heavy one at that, but our adrenaline pumping no doubt helped with this feat. We chucked it at the undead horror. The table fell topside down to the ground. The skeleton was not visible, so we rushed towards the library door, me silently ahead, but then I heard a thud, a fleshy one at that, followed by a whimper. I thought to myself, skeletons don't make that sound. I stopped and turned and saw Brummus on the ground, his arms stretched out, reaching for me. His voice was raspy, barely able to make another whimpering sound, though it was very obvious it was intended to be a scream. It was the sudden forceful fall to the ground. It must have knocked the wind from his lungs. The undead skeleton, sans its legs, was gripping Brummus by his. It pulled itself closer and with one swooping motion bit into the left calf, creating a horrible flesh-ripping crunch. Despite it being mostly dark, the moonlight from outside was enough to cast white reflection off the dark pooling liquid forming around Brummus's leg. Blood, I thought, and I must have murmured out loud because that's when the skeleton eyes darted and looked at me. Those eyes so full of malice and hatred, that was the only way I can explain it. By instinct alone, I grabbed the nearest library chair and rushed over to Brummus. Screaming with all of my might, the chair raised over my head, I ready to thrust down, but then the skeleton rears its head up and glares so brightly with its red eyes, its jaw agape. It hisses, and then limps off Brummus, who has no doubt passed out by this point. At least I hope so. The creature began to scurry away as best it could with only 2 bony arms and no legs. I being both relieved and confused as to why a horrid undead with such hate would be fearful of me. I then heard footsteps approach me from behind, but before I could turn, my shoulder was grasped yet again, and a familiar voice reassured me. It was Clarence, clad in his deity's robes, his holy symbol outward towards the abomination. That is when the stress caught up to me, and I could finally let go. My vision hazed a bit, and, well, my memories were not that good. of the next events, but the Archmagi and a number of Force students dispatched the evil thing with haste. The next day, I was interviewed by the headmaster. I was proud of myself that I did not snitch on Brummus. However, I found out not long after that he confessed. He was summarily expelled from the university. I no doubt will be under the scrutiny of the university for some time myself. And the students, they talk of that night for weeks to come, but the incident quickly fades away to newer, more recent subjects of gossip. I go about my studies and quickly adjust to a life without Brummus. It was sad, but necessary to move on. I knew not where he went. Was likely not back at home. His tuition payments were forfeit. He must be off somewhere working to make it up to his family. It wasn't until 8 moons later that I had received a letter. I waited until that evening to open it and read. It said, "Dear friend, I hope things are going well with your studies. After I was expelled, I not know what I was to do, but that very night of expulsion, I was approached by someone offering me the chance to attend a different school, one which I will not pen here. Needless to say, I accepted the offer given my less than optimal other options. I worked hard to pay my tuition, but here they offer me a chance to perform the more exotic schools of magic. If you catch my meaning. I had never been happier. It's now become something of a passion, and I hope to advance soon. Yours truly, Brummus Greyfeather." The area where the return address is most commonly is not pinned. But with a great big smile, I lifted the parchment up to the air in between the moon and me to continue reading. Well, hello and welcome to the Monstrum Compendium. This is my pilot video for my new YouTube channel, Monstrum Compendium. Here I will break down the different monsters and creatures in the Pathfinder 2e Bestiary. Who knows, I might even be able to get into some homebrew stuff. Again, this is my pilot video. I know the audio isn't the best, but I will be working on perfecting that, as well as doing better with images and whatnot. But the whole intent of this channel is, of course, to break down the different creatures in the bestiary and to kind of start with a short story in the beginning, kind of to build the mood and get the creative juices flowing. And then I would move on to the ecology, the history, whatever is most pertaining to that creature. And finally, the stat block, and give my thoughts, maybe some tips for GMs. And well, that is the intent. So without further ado, let us begin. Your basic skeleton, the bread and butter of any GM, especially for low-level parties. The Pathfinder 2e Bestiary refers to the basic skeleton as the skeleton guard. While there are other types, other categories, and different stat blocks, today's focus will be on the skeleton guard. With a creature a level of -1, it doesn't pose much threat. And again, it goes back to my point about it being meant for a low-level party. The skeleton stat block can be found on page 298 of the Pathfinder 2e Bestiary. Your basic skeleton guard comes with a +2 perception and has dark vision. They come with a +6 to acrobatics and a +3 to athletics. Certainly your basic skeleton guard is going to be more dexterous than they are with brute strength. This is further reflected in the ability scores. +2 to strength, +4 to dexterity, +0 to con, -5 to intelligence, and +0 to wisdom and charisma. Pathfinder lore certainly digs in deep on the concept that your basic skeleton is a mindless order following machine. Very much representative by that -5 to intelligence. DMs, of course, you can decide if your skeleton in your setting or your particular encounter should have a little more sentience, problem solving, bringing a little more challenge to the party. Your average skeleton guard has an AC of 16, a fortitude of +2, and a very respectable saving throw of +8, followed by, lastly, the will save of +2. It should be no surprise that skeletons, even with being held together by necrotic energy and magics, they have very little HP. This low HP is reflected of the fact, with a 4, reflected of the fact that there's really just bone. There's no muscle or flesh to really cushion anything, so, well, it doesn't take much to drop them. Skeletons and many other undead types benefit or suffer from, depending on whose perspective you ask, the negative healing ability, which means they heal from negative energy and not positive energy. Unlike most other creatures, they heal from the positive energy. Obviously, there are a number of exceptions to this, but that's for another time. Now, being healed from negative energy, undead who, well, they now are harmed by positive energy, so you have that flip-flop. A simple heal spell would damage the undead, making characters who use healing magic become, well, the bane of existence to all undead. Given skeletons and many other undead creature types, it should be no surprise that they gain the following immunities: death effects, disease, mental, paralyzed, poison, and unconsciousness. An interesting side note that I have about one of the immunities that undead have, being that of paralyzed, it occurred to me that maybe perhaps the paralyzed spell targets a living creature's body. After all, many of the other undead that exist in other parts of the Bestiary, they are also immune to paralyzed. Perhaps the spell end up something to do with the nerves of a living creature. Unlike undead who, well, even though some may actually have nerves still there, they're not really being used. As for resistances, it comes with cold 5, electricity 5, fire 5, piercing 5, and slashing 5. With these types of resistances, low-level parties have better be punching above their weight, especially to get around these resistances. Interestingly enough, they have no weaknesses. DMs, be careful here that Pathfinder does not have the bludgeoning weakness damage type to skeletons, unlike in other modules and other rules types. Skeletons have a base move speed of 25. They sport 2 different types of melee attacks, a scimitar with a +6 to hit, and that attack comes with a forceful and sweep traits, making it much more important for players to take out these skeletons before they get or stay too long in melee range. The scimitar's damage is 1d6 +2 slashing. The other type of melee attack, the second one, is the claw. It has a +6 to attack and has the agile and finesse traits. The damage is a 1d4 +2 slashing. Slashing certainly, because they're bony claws, not like bludgeoning, unlike maybe those meaty hand paws of humans. And a side note for me, I think it would be a perfectly good tactic for DMs to have the skeleton in melee, use the scimitar on the first attack, and forego the attempt at getting the forceful or sweep traits to activate, and instead use the claw attack. Players, they do not like to take damage. It's more likely that the claw would hit than the follow-up scimitar attack. But you DMs, you do as you wish. Certainly, it is in your prerogative. Another effective tactic for DMs is to use the third type of attack, which is the ranged shortbow attack. That comes with a +6 to hit and has the deadly D10 trait. A critical hit being here very possible. It will do certainly a big number of hit points for low-level parties. With a range increment of 60 feet, that is nothing to sneeze at. Backline characters, beware. Skeleton abilities adds a lot to the creature's flavor and difficulty when faced off against your players. DMs use this with caution. Sometimes you can make something very overpowered, but other times, if you know what you're doing, this can certainly add a lot of flavor. So let's get into it. Let's start talking about some of these skeleton ability types. Starting with the bloody type ability, the skeleton is covered in dripping blood and gains the fast healing equal to its level. All right, that's very simple. Collapse. Well, the trigger is if the skeleton is critically hit, the effect becomes the skeleton collapses into a pile of bones and the attack deals only normal damage. This would eliminate the critical hit and, well, they would still take damage, but it would save them from a lot. The skeleton can reform in a standing position as an action, but until it does, it is immobilized and flat-footed. Players who encounter this happening once will never forget to attack and destroy the fallen skeletons again, just to make sure. Explosive death. When the skeleton is destroyed, its bones shatter and explode as the necromantic energy holding it together are released. Adjacent creatures 5 feet away take 1d6 slashing damage per every 2 levels the skeleton is, with a minimum of 1d6. Players will then use a basic reflex save to, save here. Because the basic reflex save in the stat block is not listed, DMs, you would then want to use the 10-5 DC by level chart, or you could use what sometimes I use is the 10 plus the creature's level plus its highest ability score. Again, that's more of a choice. By default, you should probably using the 10x5 DC level chart, but it's your call. The Screaming Skull. 2 actions, having the auditory, emotion, fear, and mental traits. The skeleton removes its skull and throws it. It then makes a jaw attack with a range of 20 feet. Here I would use the basic skeleton's claw attack and perhaps replace the slashing type damage with maybe piercing damage. But again, that is going to be your choice. The skeleton then attempts to demoralize each foe within 10 feet of the target, being the skull that's probably on the ground. Keep in mind that the demoralize is part of the 2 actions to use the Screaming Skull ability. The main body, off somewhere else, probably close by, could still in theory move or attack. The head will then bounce, rolls, or perhaps flies back, returning to the skeleton at the start of its next turn. The skeleton is blind until then, being the main body. Remember, when I said that the body could move or attack using its 3rd action, don't forget to apply the blind condition to its main body. Thematically, this whole ability is awesome, I really think, and can really mix up your players when you throw it at them, pun intended. As a DM, I'd even let a player who has the attack of opportunity take a strike if the skull passes by them or, through their attack of opportunity range. Just thematically, it feels right. Blaze. The skeleton is wreathed with fire. I mean, who doesn't want a burning skeleton? The fire does not consume the bones or any gear that the skeleton may be wearing. The skeleton gains immunity to fire and weakness 5 to cold. It, of course, loses its earlier resistance to cold. That goes away. It would be very conflicting if it stayed. Its strikes now deal additional persistent fire damage equal to half the skeleton's level, minimum 1. At this point, I raise the skeleton's level to maybe 1 or 2, as suggested when you use these abilities. Some of them are more powerful than others, but certainly you want to keep them on par with what the players can handle, and of course issue out the experience as appropriate. I would probably venture to say you would want to put these types and maybe in a volcano or an underground forge or something to that effect, but certainly you don't want to throw your 1st level party at something like this. Bone Missile, another good one. This is 2 actions. The skeleton yanks a rib from its rib cage to use as an arrow or javelin. The skeleton loses HP equal to its level, minimum 1, then makes the ranged strike. This uses the attack bonus of whichever the skeleton other a strike has the highest attack bonus and deals piercing damage equal to that strike's damage plus the skeleton's level minimum 1. You can really throw the players off here when you pit them up against clearly thematically themed focused skeletons with melee swords and maybe shields. Perhaps not shields, but big swords. Here, the basic skeleton with the big old sword could then rip a bone out of his rib cage and throw it at the party at a ranged attack, dealing, was close to 1d6 plus 1 with a plus 6 to hit. Bone Powder Source. When the skeleton takes physical damage from a critical hit, magic spells don't work here, one of its bones is now pulverized into a fine powder. All creatures in a 5-foot emanation that breathe take a 1d6 persistent poison damage plus 1d6 for every 6 levels the skeleton has. I see a lot of 6s there, 666. If players encountered the skeleton ability for the first time, I'd run it as is. However, if the players successfully recall knowledge and or have shared with the other characters, or if the entire counter area is known to have these type of skeletons, I may give the players a high reflex save to attempt to negate the damage by, holding their breath. I would probably set it very high. After all, the purpose of this ability is to throw a challenge at the players, and giving them too low of a DC might negate this in its entirety. I was playing with the idea of maybe like a DC 5 plus the total damage done from the critical hit that activated this ability. But again, use that homebrew rule with caution, or idea with caution. Skeleton of Roses. Thick briars have grown through the skeleton's bones, covering it in red roses with inch-long thorns. The skeleton's unarmed strikes deal additional piercing damage equal to a third the skeleton's level, minimum 1. At the end of each of its turns, if the skeleton has caused piercing damage with its thorns, it regains hit points equal to its level, minimum 1. Each time the skeleton regains hit points, in this way, another rose blossoms. For me, I may get rid of the 1/3 and just go with a 1 damage every 3 levels instead. For me, it's just much easier to calculate, but you do you. Aquatic bones. The skeleton has bones from aquatic type creatures, allowing it to swim using a simple tail, paddles, or similar appendages. The skeleton has a swim speed of 20 feet and gains the aquatic trait and the aquatic ambush ability, making it a very nasty surprise for any adventurers that go near the water or in it. Bone Storm. 3 actions, once per day. It's pretty powerful. The effect is the skeleton transforms into a cyclone of bones, taking up the same space but twice as tall. It then strides up to double its speed as part of this ability's use, using up 3 actions here. It can move through spaces occupied by other creatures, and this movement does not trigger reactions. Creatures that the Bone Storm moves through takes 1d6 slashing damage for every 2 levels of the skeleton, and they are granted a basic reflex save against the hard DC for the creature level type. Remember that 10-5 DC level by chart. Essentially, that breaks down to like a +2 to the DC by that level chart, but I would refer to it. A level 1 or lower skeleton only moves here, so the skeleton has to be pretty high for it to activate the what I prior said, but a level 1 or lower will only allow for the movement of this ability. It does not deal damage. Well, thankfully, right? You don't want to destroy your 1-level party, 2-level party right off the bat. A creature that attempts this save will do so only once if the Bone Storm moves through its space, even if it does multiple times. At the end of the movement, the skeleton then reforms. Crumbling Bones. The skeleton is made up from crumbling bones that drift in clouds of dust. The skeleton has a fly speed of 20 feet, but it must end its turn with no more than 5 feet off the ground or it falls, taking damage as normal. In addition, the skeleton can move through any space that's large enough for its skull to fit through. As a DM, I would rule this to be even smaller. I would even go down as 1 inch in diameter. But again, you do you. Frozen. The skeleton bones are covered in a thin layer of ice. The skeleton gains immunity to cold and weakness 5 to fire, and of course loses his resistance to fire, much like the Blaze skeleton that I spoke about earlier. The skeleton is surrounded by an aura of cold that deals cold damage equal to half the skeleton's level, minimum 1, to all adjacent creatures at the start of the skeleton's turn. A basic standard reflex save for its level is applied here. Grave Eruption. 2 actions. For the requirements, the skeleton must be undetected, buried in dirt, gravel, or other loose material. The effect? The skeleton erupts from the ground, stands, and makes a melee strike. The target is flat-footed against this strike. That's good to note. If the strike hits, the target is then frightened or frightened 2 on a critical hit. As a DM, I would actually tweak this one a bit, but this is my decision, my choice, but take it for what it is for you. The target, I would think, would need the emotion trait and the fear trait and the mental traits, and instead apply the frightened condition 1 first before basing the attack on that, and then apply the frightened 2 condition after if it was a critical hit. I'm aware that this may increase the chances for a critical hit, but hey, how many times are the adventurers really going to have this sprung on them? I mean, think about it. Lacquered. During the process to create this skeleton, it was covered with several layers of alchemical lacquer, giving its bones a golden hue and granting some added protection. The skeleton gains acid resistance 5 and a +2 status bonus to saves against effects that age or erode the target. I don't see it used too much, maybe for thematic purposes here, but hey, it's good to have as an option. Nimble. The skeleton is particularly fast and nimble. Its land speed increases by 10 feet, and it has a climb speed of 20. In addition, it gains the nimble dodge reaction. All around a good choice, I think, but certainly increases the creature's difficulty here. And lastly, rotten. The bones of the skeleton are black and rotten, having spent years in polluted water or some other foul substance, maybe sewers or swamp. The skeleton loses its resistances to piercing and slashing damage and now becomes surrounded by a horrific stench in a 10-foot aura. A creature entering or starting its turn in the aura must succeed on a fortitude save against the creature's standard DC level or become sickened 1. Plus, you can get slowed 1 for as long as it remains sickened on a critical failure. meaning as long as the character continues to roll critical failures against the DC, they stay slowed. While in the aura, affected creatures take a -2 circumstance penalty to saves against disease and to recover from the sickened condition. A creature that succeeds at its save is temporarily immune for 1 minute. This stench remains for 1 hour after the rotten skeleton has been destroyed, unless the bones have been burned or the rot has been washed away with at least 1 gallon of water. Couple this ability with something else that causes disease, and man, this would suck for your party. Great entertainment for DMs. And well, thank you. That's it for this video. Thank you for joining me on this pilot video. I do appreciate everyone who views. If you want to make any comments, please leave so down below. And I look forward to creating the next video and sharing it with everybody.